Ruth Calloway had counted out the pay for 60 men every other Friday for 14 months, and not one of them would take his envelope from any other hand. She licked her thumb. She counted the singles under a bare bulb at a scarred oak desk, the same desk her husband had leaned on for 22 years, and the men lined up hats in hand and waited for her nod. Then, the owner's son came home from the city. He looked at her once. He called her just the help my father kept on out of pity, and he told the office manager to run the payroll instead. 60 men set their tools down. Not one of them took a dime. And that same night the bank's note came due, and the manager came up short. And a man in a good suit stood alone in an empty plant, holding a cash box he could not make add up, knowing there was exactly one person the men would trust with it. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small kindness, subscribe so these stories keep finding you. And comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me take you to Ashford, Ohio, in the autumn of 1961. The plant sat at the end of Depot Street, where the road gave out into gravel and goldenrod. Halloran Tool and Die. The sign had lost its shine years back, and the H had a rust streak running down it like a tear. But the men who worked there didn't look at the sign. They looked at the two big presses inside, old as the century, that stamped and groaned and paid their mortgages. 61 men, if you counted the boy who swept. 2 aging machines. 1 bare bulb office off the shop floor where the money was counted. Ruth Calloway came to that office every other Friday. She was 44 that fall. Wide through the shoulders from a life of work, gray coming in soft at her temples, hands that had gone hard the way honest hands do. She wore the same gray dress most days, and a plain wool coat when the mornings turned, and she wore them without any thought of how she looked, because looking was a thing other women had time for. She did not think herself pretty. She had stopped thinking about it a long while ago. She thought herself useful, which to her was the higher word. Her Tom had been foreman there for 22 years. 22 years of walking that floor, knowing every man's name and every man's trouble, keeping the presses fed and the line whole. And 14 months ago, the number 2 press had taken him. It was quick, they told her, as if quick were a mercy. She had buried him on a Tuesday, and on the Friday after, when the pay was due, the men had stood in that office not knowing what to do with their grief or their envelopes, and old Pop Dresser had taken off his hat and said, "Ruth, Tom always said you were the only one in this place who could count past 10 without stealing. Would you do it? Would you count us out?" So she had. And she had not stopped. It was not a paying job, exactly, management let her, because it cost them nothing, and the men were quiet when she did it. But the men knew what she was. She was the reason a man got every dollar he was owed, and not a penny rounded down. She was the one who kept a small book of her own, in pencil, with every man's dependents written in her tidy hand. Not their numbers, their names. She knew that Al Prochaska had 4, and the youngest had the croup that winter. She knew that the Sokol boy sent money home to his mother in Youngstown. She knew who drank his, and who saved his, and who had a wife counting on every cent before it was even warm in his pocket. And she knew about young Eddie Marsh. Eddie was 22, and had a wage garnishment on him from a hospital bill, his little girl's, and the county took a piece off the top before the boy ever saw it. Some Fridays what was left would not feed a family of 3. Ruth had never said a word about it. She simply, quietly, some Fridays, made up the difference out of her own envelope, the small one management gave her for the counting, and she slid it into Eddie's without a look, so that his pay came out to what a man's pay ought to be. Eddie did not know. She meant for him never to know. She had done it for 11 months, and if you had asked her why she'd have said the child had to eat, as if that ended the matter. which for Ruth it did. That was the woman. Now here comes the trouble. The trouble came in a gray suit off the morning train, with a leather ledger under his arm and city dust on his good shoes. Peter Halloran was 33 years old and had spent the last decade in Chicago, in offices with carpet, learning the parts of business that had numbers and no grease. His father Gideon owned the plant, or what was left of it, and his father Gideon was dying, slow and stubborn, in the big house on the hill, and the plant was going under. So the son came home to save the thing he had been raised, quietly, to look down on. He had grown up above that floor. He had learned the smell of cutting oil the way rich boys learn the smell of a barn, as a thing that was theirs and beneath them at the same time. He walked the floor that first morning with Coyle, the office manager, a soft, pale man in sleeve garters, who agreed with whatever was said last. Peter looked at the presses and did sums in his head, and the sums were bad. And then he came to the little office and saw a middle-aged woman in a gray dress sitting at the pay desk with a pencil and a dented tin box beside her. And he asked Coyle who she was. "That's Mrs. Calloway," Coyle said. "The foreman's widow. She counts the pay." "She counts the pay," Peter said. "The men prefer it." Peter Halloran had come home to fix a business, and a business that let a widow sit at the money because the men preferred it was, to him, the whole sickness in one picture. Sentiment where the numbers should be. He did not raise his voice. He was not a cruel man, only a certain kind of blind one. He said, "That won't do. Mr. Coyle, you'll run the payroll from now on, properly, through the books." And then, half to Coyle and half to the room, in the voice of a man stating an obvious thing, he said the sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. "She's just the help my father kept on out of pity. We can't run a plant on charity." The floor did not go silent, because the presses were running and the presses don't stop for a man's pride. But the men nearest heard. Pop Dresser heard. And Ruth heard. She did not flinch. That was the thing that would stay with Peter later, when he was ashamed how she had not flinched. She set her pencil down. She looked at him, steady, with eyes that had buried a husband and gone back to work, and she said only this: "Your father and my Tom had an understanding about this floor's money. You might read Tom's book before you change the way it's counted." And she put her hand flat on the dented tin box for a moment, the way you'd rest a hand on a shoulder. Then she stood and gathered her small pencil ledger and left the office to the men and the pale manager and the son, who had already decided he knew everything the box could hold. Peter did not open the box. He did not read Tom's book. He had a note coming due and a father dying and no time, he told himself, for a widow's keepsakes. He set the tin box on a shelf and forgot it. Remember the box. Everything is in the box. The next payday was 2 Fridays on, and I want you to see it the way the men saw it, because this is the day the whole town's opinion of Peter Halloran was made. The pay came to $4,180 every other Friday. 60 envelopes, counted to the man, wages and overtime, and the small, careful arithmetic of a working payroll. Coyle sat at the desk where Ruth used to sit. He had the cash from the bank in banded stacks. He had his ledger and his adding machine and his sleeve garters, and he had the whole floor watching him, because word travels on a shop floor faster than on any wire. Coyle counted it out. And Coyle's count came up wrong. Not by much, but the first man in line, Al Prochaska, opened his envelope right there, the way no man ever had to do when Ruth counted, and he looked at it a long moment, and he said, "This is light $3. Mr. Coyle." Coyle went red and recounted, and made it right, and waved the next man on. But now every man opened his envelope. And the fourth man was light too, and Coyle recounted the whole stack with the adding machine clattering, sweat on his lip, and came up with a different total than his own ledger showed, twice, and could not say where the difference lived. And here is what 60 men do in a plant when the money can't be trusted. They set their tools down. Not in anger. That is the part Peter never forgot. There was no shouting. Pop Dresser just reached over and pulled the switch on his press, and the great machine wound down to silence. And then the next man did, and the next, until the whole floor stood quiet as a church, and 60 men stood in a line with their hats in their hands, and would not take $1 from Coyle's shaking fingers. They did not walk out. They did not threaten. They simply would not be paid wrong. They would rather stand there unpaid than take money that had been counted by a hand they didn't trust. Peter came out of the inner office into that silence. He had never heard the plant quiet in daylight in his life. It frightened him more than any shouting could have. He looked at 60 men standing, and the manager gray-faced at the desk, and he understood, dimly, that he was watching something he did not have the tools to fix. Because the thing that was broken was not in the ledger. It was trust, and trust is not an entry you can post. And into that silence, Ruth Calloway walked. Nobody had sent for her. Pop Dresser had, in fact, sent his grandson running down Depot Street the moment the tools went down, but no one told Peter that. To Peter it looked like she simply appeared, in her gray dress, as if the floor had called her up out of itself. She did not look at Peter. She went to the desk. She said, quietly, "Mr. Coyle, may I?" And it was not a question, and the pale man got up so fast he knocked the chair. She sat. She squared the stacks. She licked her thumb. And she counted out $4,180 to 60 men in 20 minutes, and every man got his envelope from her hand, and every envelope was right to the penny, and Eddie Marsh's came out to what a man's pay ought to be, and no one but Ruth knew why. The presses came back on one at a time as the men were paid, until the floor roared again like nothing had happened, and Peter Halloran stood against the wall of his own plant and watched a woman he had called Charity hold his father's business together with a pencil and a wet thumb. He did not say anything to her that day. He was not ready. But something had cracked in the certainty he'd brought home from Chicago, and through the crack, for the first time, a little doubt came in. That night the rest of the floor fell out from under him. Because there was the other number, the one the men didn't know and Peter couldn't sleep for. Meridian Trust held the plant's note, $28,000, and it fell due in 30 days, and Harlan Meridian was not a patient man, nor a kind one, and the interest on it was a slow bleed the plant could not survive much longer. Peter had come home to refinance that note or lose the plant. And that same night, with the payday disaster fresh, Coyle came to Peter's office with his hat in his hands and quit. Just quit. Said he could not run a payroll the men wouldn't take and couldn't face the bank besides, and he was gone on the late train, sleeve garters and all. So Peter sat alone in the office at 9 at night with the cash box open in front of him. Not the payroll, that was done, but the running box, the petty accounts and the float and the small daily money of a plant. And there was a discrepancy in it Coyle had left behind, and Peter could not find it. He was a man who read ledgers. He had read ledgers for 10 years. And he sat there under the bare bulb and could not make the box balance, and there was no one left to ask. The one clerk who remained was a boy of 19 who wept when you spoke sharp to him. Coyle was on a train. His father was dying and could not be troubled. The bank was the enemy. There was exactly one person in Ashford, Ohio, the men would trust with money. And he had called her Charity in front of the whole floor. I want you to sit with the size of what he had to do next, because pride is a heavy thing to carry to a woman's door. It was near 10 when he walked down Depot Street in the cold. The plant behind him, dark. Her house was small and neat. 4 rooms and a picket fence gone soft with age. A light on in the kitchen window, yellow and warm against the blue dark. He stood at the gate a long minute, Then he took his hat off, which he noticed he was doing, and did not stop himself, and he went up and knocked. She opened the door in an apron with flour on her hands. She was not surprised to see him. That unsettled him too, that she seemed to have been expecting the world to send him eventually. "Mr. Halloran," she said. He had a whole speech. He'd made it walking down. It had the word arrangement in it and the word compensation, and it kept the thing at a business distance where he was comfortable. He opened his mouth to give it, and none of it came. What came instead was the plain truth, which surprised him more than her. "Mrs. Calloway, the men trust you." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't. Not because of anything you've done. Because of everything I don't understand about this place. Coyle's gone. The note's due in 29 days, and I can't make the box balance, and there's not a soul in that plant the men will take $1 from but you." He stopped. Then, quieter, "I need you to take the payroll. All of it. I'm not asking for my father. I'm asking for the men." She looked at him for a long time in the yellow light of her own doorway. She was reading him the way she read a column of figures, and he had the strange feeling of being counted. "Not for you," she said at last. "No," he said. "For them." "Then all right." She stepped back from the door. "Wipe your feet. I've got coffee." That was the first cup. "I'm going to slow down for it, because it matters more than it looks." She had a blue enamel coffee pot she kept on a hot plate, a chipped old thing the color of a robin's egg, and she poured him a cup at her kitchen table while he sat with his hat on his knee like a boy. He had eaten in the finest rooms in Chicago. He could not, later, remember one of those meals, but he remembered that cup. It was strong and a little burnt, and she poured it without asking how he took it, and he drank it black because she had set no sugar out, and he was too proud and too grateful to ask. And she watched him drink it, the son who'd called her Charity, sitting at her table asking for help, and something in her that had gone very hard and careful over 14 months allowed itself, just for a second, to be a little sorry for him. They started the next morning, and now the days begin to run together the way days do when two people are working late over the same problem. They set up in the office, Ruth at the pay desk where she belonged, Peter across from her with the books, and the dented tin box back on the desk between them where it had always sat, though he still hadn't opened it, and she didn't press. The blue coffee pot came to live on the office hot plate. She poured for the men when they came in with questions, and they took their coffee from her the way they took their pay, and Peter watched how the floor came to her, how they told her things they'd never tell an owner, how the plant's whole nervous system ran through this one steady woman he'd tried to send away. He worked late. She worked later. And in the working, the small things started. One night he fell asleep at the desk near midnight, head down on his arm over a column of figures, and when he stirred an hour later there was a coat over his shoulders. A man's coat, old, heavy canvas, smelling of cutting oil and cedar. Tom's shop coat. She had kept it on a peg by the office door for 14 months and never let anyone touch it, and she had taken it down and laid it over the sleeping son of the man her husband had served, and then gone back to her counting as if it were nothing. Peter sat very still under that coat for a while before he let her know he was awake. He did not know whose coat it was. But he knew it was a kindness that cost her something, and he was learning, slowly, to notice what things cost. And she noticed things too. She noticed he didn't eat. A man running scared on a dying plant forgets to eat, and she saw it, the way his suit had started to hang. The gray under his eyes. She didn't fuss. Ruth did not fuss over anyone. But she started leaving a sandwich wrapped in wax paper on the corner of his desk in the afternoons, and she never said a word about it, and neither did he, and it was there every day. He learned how she took her coffee. This was the thing that got him. He watched her enough days to learn it without being told, cream and no sugar, and let it sit a minute till it wasn't scalding, and one gray afternoon when the pot was fresh he poured a cup, and fixed it that way and set it by her elbow without a word, the way she left the sandwiches. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. She didn't say thank you, because thank you would have made it a thing, and it was safer as not a thing. She just drank it. But her ears went a little pink, and Peter Halloran, 33 and raised to look down on this whole floor, felt a stupid pride at having gotten a cup of coffee right that he had not felt at closing deals worth more than the plant. Now, the work itself. Because it wasn't all coffee. There was a bank trying to eat them. Meridian Trust had sent an audit before Peter ever came home, a set of figures that said the plant's shortfall was worse than the book showed, that there was money unaccounted, that Halloran Tool and Die was a worse risk than even Gideon knew, all of which made the case for calling the note and taking the plant. Peter had accepted those figures. Banks did not make arithmetic errors. That was practically the definition of a bank. He had been half arguing for Meridian's numbers without quite realizing it, defeated before he started. It was Ruth who found it. She was going back through the accounts one night, not because Peter asked her to, but because she counted things. It was simply what she did with a column of figures. She made them true. And she stopped. And she went back. And she laid the plant's ledger beside the bank's audit under the bare bulb, and put her worn finger on one line and then another, and she said, "Mr. Halloran, come look at this." He came around the desk and leaned over her shoulder, close enough to smell the plain soap she used. And she showed him. The shortfall the bank had cited, the missing money that made the whole case, it wasn't missing. It had been counted twice. A transfer entered as an expense in one book and again in another, so that the same $6,000 showed as a whole when it had only ever been moved from one pocket to the next. A double entry. The bank's own figures, when you laid them true, did not show a plant bleeding out. They showed a plant that was tight and tired but honest, and a bank that had either blundered or wanted very badly to be believed. Peter straightened up slow. He looked at the woman at the desk, the widow he'd called Charity, who had just found in one night what his 10 years of Chicago and the bank's whole audit department had missed or hidden. "How did you?" he started. "I count things," Ruth said. "I've been counting this floor's money since before you could reach the desk. A man's pay isn't a number to me. Mr. Halloran, it's a family's supper. You don't lose track of a family's supper." She squared the pages. "Your bank made a mistake. Or it didn't. Either way, I wouldn't sign a thing they put in front of you till a Callaway's read it twice." He did not sleep that night either, but for a different reason. He was beginning, against everything he'd come home believing, to think that the most valuable person in his failing plant was the one he'd tried to throw away, and the thought turned him around in the dark like a man lost in his own house. But the bank was not the only pressure coming, and the next kind had a face and furs, and a father with a fountain pen. Harlan Meridian ran Meridian Trust the way a spider runs a web, patiently, from the center. Waiting, he held the note, and he knew the plant couldn't pay it, and a foreclosed Tool and Die on the edge of Ashford was worth more to him broken up than running. But Meridian was a careful man, and there was a cleaner way to take a thing than to break it. And the clean way had a name, and the name was Vivian. Vivian Meridian was 29, poised, lovely in the cool, expensive way of women who have never once wondered where the rent was coming from. And an arrangement had been floated, gently, between old families, the kind of arrangement that gets called a merger when there's money and a match when there's a girl. If Peter Halloran married Harlan Meridian's daughter, the bank would refinance the note. The plant would be folded into the Meridian holdings, safe, saved, absorbed. Gideon Halloran, dying up on the hill, thought it was the answer to his prayers. He sent for his son and pressed his cold hand and told him plainly, in the voice of a man who wanted to die with the thing settled, that Vivian was sensible and the bank was sure and love was a luxury a Halloran couldn't afford this year. Marry the girl. Save the plant. Do your duty. And Peter, who had come home precisely to do his duty and prove himself to his father, could find no clean argument against it. Except that when he thought about it, when he pictured that life, something in his chest set its tools down and went quiet, and he could not for a while understand why. Then Vivian came to the floor, and the floor understood for him. She came on a Thursday in furs, driven, to see the plant she was to be married into, and she moved through it like a woman walking through a barn she'd been told she owned. She smiled at the men and did not learn one name. She called the presses charming and the noise dreadful in the same breath. And she came to the little office, and she saw Ruth at the pay desk in her gray dress, and she looked at her the way you look at a piece of old furniture that came with the house, and she said to Peter, not troubling to lower her voice, "How quaint. You've kept the local color." And she smiled at Ruth, a bright cold smile, and said, "You must be such a comfort to these rough men, dear." Ruth said, "I count their pay. Nothing else," and went back to her counting. But the whole floor had heard the word quaint, and the whole floor had seen Vivian Meridian fail to learn a single name, and a shop floor keeps its accounts on people the same careful way Ruth kept them on money. The men said nothing. They just knew, now, what they were being asked to be sold into. And then came the supper, and this is where you saw it plainest. It was the plant's anniversary, an old tradition Tom had kept alive, a supper in the town hall for the men and their families every fall, tables end to end and the women's covered dishes, and the children underfoot. Gideon had always come in the old days. This year Gideon was too sick, so the town expected Peter, and Peter came, and he brought Vivian, because his father had asked him to be seen with her, and he was still trying to do his duty. Ruth came in her plain Sunday dress. It was navy blue and 10 years old and pressed within an inch of its life, and it was the only good dress she owned. And she wore it without apology. And here is what the town hall showed anyone with eyes. The men's wives, who had buried people beside Ruth and borrowed cups of sugar from Ruth, and been sat up with through fevers by Ruth, they came to her. All night. They embraced her at the door and pulled her to their tables and put babies in her arms and told her their troubles. Because Ruth Calloway in her 10-year-old dress was the truest woman in that room, and everybody in it but the newcomers knew it. And Vivian Meridian, in a gown that cost more than a press, stood near the punch with her cool smile, and could not get a single one of those women to warm to her, try as she did, because they could smell what she was, the way you smell weather coming. Peter watched it all from the side of the room. He watched the plain widow be the heart of his father's plant, and the beautiful heiress be a stranger in it, and he understood something he did not yet have the courage to name. That worth was not what you were born to. That a person's real value was written in how people trusted them, not in the deed to a bank. He looked at Ruth with a baby on her hip, laughing at something Pop Dresser's wife said, and he felt the arranged and sensible future his father wanted for him turn to ash on his tongue. He walked her home. He didn't plan to. Vivian had left early, cold and bored, driven off in the good car, and the supper broke up, and somehow Peter fell into step beside Ruth on the walk down toward Depot Street, and neither of them remarked on it. There was ice on the sidewalk. Ashford Octobers turn hard at night. And on a bad patch under the streetlight her foot went, just slightly, and his hand came out and caught her arm, and steadied her, and he did not let go. That was all. He held her arm the rest of the block. Through the pool of the streetlight and out the other side into the dark, 1 block, longer than steadying required, longer than was proper, and she did not pull away, and he did not release her, and neither of them said one word about the warm, foolish thing that was happening between a widow and the owner's son on an icy sidewalk in a small Ohio town. At her gate he let go. He said, "Good night, Mrs. Calloway," in a voice that had gone strange, and she said, "Good night, Mrs. Halloran," and went in. And stood with her back against her own closed door in the dark kitchen for a long time, with her hand pressed flat over her heart, like a woman holding something in that wanted out. She told herself she was too old and too plain, and too much the help for whatever that was. She told herself she was the floor's backbone, and no one's match, that she had a place, and it was behind the pay desk, and that a woman who forgot her place got her heart broken. She had built those walls carefully over 14 months. She leaned on them now. But she had felt his hand on her arm through her coat sleeve for 1 block too long, and the walls, for the first time, felt thin. The note was down to under 3 weeks now. And in that pressure, Peter made the decision that changed everything, the one that told the whole floor which way he had turned. He came to Ruth at the pay desk on a gray Monday with a set of papers, and he was nervous, she could see it, this city man who'd come home so sure. He laid the papers down between them beside the dented tin box, and he said, "Mrs. Calloway, I've been to a lawyer in Miller's Falls. Not Meridian's, my own." He pushed the papers toward her. "If the bank calls that note, or if something happens to me, or to my father, the men's wages can't be the first thing that gets seized. I won't have it. I've set up a trust. The payroll accounts, separate, protected. In the name of a trustee the bank can't touch, and the men will believe." He put his finger on the line where a signature went. "I need it to be you. Co-signed. In your name, Ruth Calloway, trustee of the men's wages. So that whatever happens to me or this family, 60 families still get paid. Because the money's in the one pair of hands nobody in Ashford would ever question." She looked at the papers a long moment. She understood exactly what he was doing. He was staking the survival of his men on her honesty over the bank's paper, in writing, in the open, where his father and Harlan Meridian and the whole board would see that the owner's son had put the floor's money into the widow's name. He was choosing what she was, over what she'd been born. It was the highest thing anyone had said to her since Pop Dresser took off his hat the Friday after Tom died. "You know what people will say," she said quietly. "A woman. The help. Signing for the wages. Let them say it," Peter said. And he meant it, and she saw that he meant it, and that was the moment, though neither of them would have called it that, when the thing between them stopped being coffee and coats and stolen blocks on the ice and became something with a shape. Ruth Calloway picked up the pen. She signed her name in her tidy hand. Ruth Calloway, trustee, and the men, when they heard, and they heard by noon, because a floor hears everything, stood a little straighter at their machines because the son who'd called her Charity now trusted her with the one thing they trusted her with. And that meant, maybe, just maybe, the boy from Chicago wasn't a fool after all. She should have felt only satisfaction. She'd protected Tom's men, that was all she'd ever wanted. But that night, alone with the blue coffee pot and the quiet, she took Tom's private ledger out of the dented tin box, the one Peter still hadn't read, and she sat with it in her lap and did not open it. She just held it. Because there was a thing in that book that changed everything, a thing about the Hallorans and the Calloways, and a debt that ran the other way from how the whole town believed. And she had kept it 14 months, kept it her whole marriage, and now the man it concerned was pouring her coffee the way she took it, and catching her arm on the ice and signing the men into her keeping, and she did not know how much longer she could sit across a desk from him with the truth of what his family owed hers locked in a tin box between them. She heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Late, a man's tread, coming up Depot Street toward her gate, slow, uncertain, stopping. And Ruth Calloway sat very still in her dark kitchen, with her husband's secret in her hands, and waited for the knock. The knock came soft. 2 raps, then a pause, then a third, like a man who wasn't sure he had the right to knock at all. Ruth set the ledger back in the tin box and closed the lid. She smoothed her apron. She crossed the 4 rooms of her small house on Depot Street, with the blue pot still ticking on the hot plate behind her, and she opened the door. Peter Halloran stood on her step with his hat in his hands and snow melting on his shoulders. "It's late," he said. "I know it's late." "It is. I couldn't sleep." He turned the hat brim in a slow circle. "I went walking. My feet brought me here. I didn't plan it." She looked at him a long moment. The cold came in around him and touched her ankles. Behind her the pot began to sing. "You'll let the heat out," she said, and stepped back. And he came in. He'd been in this kitchen before, over the books, in daylight, with Coyle's ghost between them and the note hanging over both their heads. This was different. She felt it, and he felt it, and neither of them said so. She poured him a cup the way he'd learned to take it. Black, no sugar, and she poured herself one the way she took it. A little milk. And they sat at her table under the one bulb. "The men stood straighter today," he said. "After I signed you trustee." Popdresser tipped his hat to me. 22 years my father owned that floor, and I don't think Popdresser ever tipped his hat to a Halloran. He tipped it to what you did, not to your name. I'm learning the difference. He turned the cup. "You taught me that. In about 3 weeks you taught me a thing my father couldn't teach me in 33 years. Ruth said nothing. The truth sat in the tin box in the other room and pressed on her chest like a hand. He didn't leave for an hour. They talked of small things. Of Al Prochaska's youngest and the croup that wouldn't break. Of the Sokol boy who wired half his pay to his mother in Youngstown and never once complained. Of Eddie Marsh, 22, with the garnishment eating his envelope. She did not tell Peter that she'd been covering Eddie's short pay out of her own for 11 months. That was hers. That was between her and God and the boy who didn't know. When Peter stood to go, he stopped at the door. He looked at the peg where Tom's old shop coat still hung, the coat she couldn't bring herself to give to the church. "Whose is that?" "A working man's," she said. "It keeps the draft off the door." He nodded and put on his hat and went out into the snow, and she watched his tread go down Depot Street, slower than a young man's, and she thought, "God help me," and she did not know which of them she was asking help for. They worked late the whole of that week and the next. The note sat 30 days out, then 29, then fewer, and the arithmetic would not lie down. Every evening she came to the office after the whistle, and they bent over the books together under the desk lamp while the presses cooled and ticked in the dark plant beyond the glass. One night he fell asleep at the desk. She'd gone to the hot plate to freshen the pot, and when she turned around his head was down on his folded arm over the ledger, and his breathing had gone deep and even. 33 years old and gray already at the temple from a plant he never wanted, sent home to save a thing he'd been raised to look down on, and sleeping now like a boy who'd run himself past the end of his strength. She should have woken him. She didn't. She took Tom's shopcoat off the peg by the door, and she laid it over his shoulders, careful, so the weight wouldn't rouse him. His breathing didn't change. She stood there a moment with her hand near his shoulder and did not put it down, and then she went back to the books and worked in the quiet with the man she could not have, sleeping under her dead husband's coat, and she did not tell him whose coat it was. She never would. He woke near midnight, confused, warm, the coat sliding off him. "You should have sent me home," he said. "You needed the sleep more than the walk." He looked at the coat in his hands. "This is warm. This is a good coat. Put it back on the peg," she said, "and eat something." "You didn't eat today. You never eat when the numbers are bad." He stared at her. "How do you know I didn't eat?" "Because I watch the men," she said simply. "It's the whole of my job. Sit down. I've got bread, and there's soup." And the next night, without a word passing, when she came in from the cold he had the pot already going, and he poured her cup before she asked, a little milk, the way she took it. and set it at her elbow, and neither of them remarked on it, because to remark on it would be to admit the centimeter, and the centimeter was forbidden, and they both knew it. It was Ruth who found the error. She'd been going over Meridian Trust's audit for the 4th time, the one that named the plant's shortfall, the number that was going to sink them when the note came due, and her thumb stopped on a column. She licked it, turned back a page, turned forward again. She sat very still. "Peter, bring the lamp closer." He came around the desk. She laid her finger on the figure. "They've counted this here," she said, "and they've counted it again here. The same $6,000. Once as a debt against the plant, and once as a call on the note. It's the same money, Peter. They've made us owe it twice." He bent over the page. She heard his breath stop. He took the pencil out of her fingers and ran the columns himself, once, twice, the way a man checks a thing he's afraid to believe. $6,000, he said. Double counted. He straightened. He looked at her the way a man looks at dry land. The accountants missed it. My father's accountants and the bank's both, and a foreman's widow with a scarred desk and a bare bulb found it in 4 passes. "I count for a living," she said. "It's all counting, Peter, pay envelopes or audits. $1's a dollar wherever you set it down." He laughed, short, almost helpless. "My father kept you on out of pity," he said. "That's what I told the floor. God forgive me. My father kept the sharpest set of eyes in Ashford, Ohio, and called it charity." She turned her face away so he wouldn't see it land. The pressure came the way pressure comes in a small town, wearing a good coat. Harlan Meridian drove out from the bank in a long car and sat in the office in his overcoat and offered to refinance the whole $28,000 note, generous terms. A Christian's terms, on one condition: that Peter marry his daughter Vivian and fold Halloran Tool and die into the Meridian Holdings, clean and quiet, a family matter between families. Gideon, from his sickbed up in the big house on the hill, sent word by his nurse that the boy should take the match. The plant saved. The men kept on. The Halloran name secured by a banker's daughter. Safe. It was the safe thing. Gideon had spent his life learning that the safe thing and the right thing were not always the same coin, and he had spent it too late to teach his son the lesson clean. Vivian Meridian came to see the floor. She came in furs on a Tuesday, 29 years old and poised as a portrait, and she walked the line between the presses with a handkerchief near her nose, and she smiled at the men the way you smile at a horse you're thinking of buying. She stopped at Ruth's pay desk. She looked at the dented tin box, the bare bulb, the scarred wood. "So you're the widow," she said. "The one they all talk about. How quaint. Peter says you keep the little accounts. I keep the men's pay," Ruth said. "Yes, the little accounts." Vivian drew her fur tighter. "Well, when Peter and I are settled, we'll modernize all this. Machines to count the money now, you know. Cleaner, no offense meant. But a plant this size can't run on a widow with a thumb and a candle, can it?" She smiled and moved on, and behind her Pop dresser turned his head and spat, careful, into the sawdust, and said nothing, which from Pop was a whole speech. The anniversary supper was that Saturday in the church hall in town, the plant's own, the men and their wives, 22 years of it, and everyone came. Ruth wore her plain Sunday dress, the navy one, the only good one, and she stood by the coffee urn, because standing by the urn was where she knew what to do with her hands. She never got a moment's peace at that urn. Al Prochaska's wife came and held both her hands and thanked her, God thank you, for the croup was broken and the baby had slept. And she knew, everyone knew, whose extra dollars had gone for the doctor even if no one said. The Sokol boy's mother had sent a letter of thanks from Youngstown, and the boy read it out shy and red-faced. And it was Ruth's name in it. Eddie Marsh's young wife hugged her and cried a little, and didn't know why she was crying, only that the widow at the urn was the reason her table had food, and she couldn't have said how she knew that either. And Vivian Meridian sat at the head table in her furs, correct and lovely and cold, and not one worker's wife crossed the room to her. They were polite. They nodded. But they came to the urn. They came to Ruth. And Peter, standing between the two of them, the banker's daughter at the head table and the widow at the coffee urn, saw it with his own eyes, saw where the warmth of 60 families flowed, and it did not flow toward the fur. He walked her home after on the ice. The streets had frozen slick under a hard, clear sky, and the walk down to Depot Street was treacherous in good shoes. At the corner by the 5 and dime, her foot went out from under her, and his hand was there, under her arm, and he caught her. He didn't let go. They walked the length of 1 block that way, her arm through his on the ice, close enough that her shoulder touched his coat, and neither of them said a word, and neither of them let go, and it was 1 block too long, and they both knew it, and they walked it anyway. At her gate he released her arm slowly, like setting down something breakable. "Good night, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Good night," she said. She did not say his name. She was afraid of what her voice would do to it. The note came closer. The men heard the rumor before Peter could stop it, the way a floor hears everything, the rumor that Meridian's refinancing meant layoffs, that the machines Vivian talked of would come, that some of them would be let go before spring. On a gray Thursday, Pop Dresser walked to the middle of the floor and put his hand on the number 2 press switch, the one that had taken Tom. And the whole line went quiet, waiting for him to pull it. It was Ruth who crossed the floor, not Peter. "Pop," she said, "take your hand off that switch. They're going to put us out, Ruth, Meridian's machines." "We heard." "You heard wrong." She stood in the middle of 60 men with her hands folded in front of her apron like she was standing in church. "Now you all listen to me, because you know I don't tell a lie about money, and I won't tell one about your jobs. There's no machine coming while I count this pay. And I will count this pay. Every other Friday, this desk, this box, my thumb, until the last press in this building stops turning for good. You have my word, and you know what my word is worth, because you've taken it in an envelope for 14 months, and it was never once light by a penny. Now pick your tools back up. Al, your baby's well. Eddie, your girl's medicine's paid. Go back to work and let me count your money." And they did. Pop Dresser took his hand off the switch. 60 men picked up their tools, and the presses started again. And the walkout that would have finished the plant died in the middle of the floor, because the foreman's widow gave her word. Peter stood in the office doorway and watched her do it. Watched her hold 60 families together with her folded hands and her plain flat voice. And something moved across his face that had nothing to do with the plant, or the note, or his father, or the safe match up on the hill. He came out onto the floor when the men had settled. He stood in front of her. He opened his mouth. "Ruth," he said. Just that. The first time. Her name, in his mouth, in front of the presses. And then he stopped, because there was nowhere for it to go that wasn't off a cliff, and he closed his mouth, and she looked at him, and the whole thing was in the look, the whole forbidden, impossible thing. And neither of them said one more word. He turned and went back into the office. She went back to her desk. And the presses ran. That was the night she gave him the ledger. She came to the office after the whistle, and she had the tin box under her arm, and she set it on the desk between them, and she took out Tom's private book, the small one, the one Peter had never read. "You've trusted me with everything," she said. "The whole payroll. Your name on a paper making me trustee. It's time I trusted you with this. It's why the men trust a Calloway with their money and no one else. It's why I couldn't sit across this desk from you another week with it locked up between us. Read it." He opened it. He read her husband's tight small hand by the desk lamp, and she watched his face change as he read, watched the color leave it. Because what was written there was this: that 10 years ago, the autumn a bank call nearly took the plant, Gideon Halloran had quietly skimmed the men's pay to cover it. A little from each envelope, not enough for any one man to catch. $3 here, $1 there. Spread thin across 60 men so no single family would starve, just so the plant wouldn't fall. And that Tom Calloway, Foreman, had found it in a week, because Tom counted too. And Tom had not exposed his owner. And Tom had not let one man be robbed. Tom Calloway had covered it himself. $9 a week out of his own foreman's pay, every week, for 2 years, quietly, into the men's envelopes to make each one whole, so that no man on that floor was ever short a dime, and no man ever knew. And Gideon's honor stayed intact, and the men's faith stayed intact, and the only one who paid was Tom, who told no one, not even the men he was covering, not even, for a long time, his own wife. $9 a week. 2 years, a foreman's whole small margin, given away in silence. Peter set the book down. His hands weren't steady. "My father stole from these men," he said, "and your husband paid it back for him, out of his own pocket, and kept my father's name clean doing it." Tom said a floor runs on faith, Ruth said quietly. He said the day the men stop trusting the pay envelope is the day the plant dies, and it doesn't matter whose fault the shortage was. He said keeping the faith was worth $9 a week to him. He never told me till the 2nd year. I found the entries. I made him tell me. That's why they'd only take their pay from you. Peter's voice had gone rough. Not because you're careful, because you're his. Because a Calloway already bled for that box once and never said a word. "Now you know what your family owes mine," she said. "It runs the other way from how the whole town tells it. Peter, the Hallorans have money and the Calloways have the debt. That's the story. And it's a lie. It always was." He looked at her across the desk, across the tin box and the small book and 10 years, and the whole shape of the world he'd been raised in turned over in front of him. The scandal came on payday. The cash came up $600 short. Ruth counted it 3 times. She knew to the penny what the box should hold, $4,180, and it held $600 less, and she'd drawn it herself from the bank that morning, and she knew before she'd finished the second count, that it had not been light when she signed for it. Harlan Meridian was in the office within the hour. He had come, he said, to review the accounts before the note came due. What a convenient thing to be present for. He stood in his overcoat with 2 of the board behind him, and he looked at the short box, and he looked at Ruth Calloway, and he said the thing he'd driven out to say. "Only the widow touches the money," he said. "Isn't that so? 60 men, none of them near this box. Only her hand. Well, $600 doesn't walk off on its own." The office went silent. Peter came up out of his chair. "You're accusing her of theft." "I'm observing," Meridian said smoothly, "that the money the men insisted be kept by one pair of hands is short by $600, and there is only one pair of hands. I make no accusation, I state a sum. The board can draw its own conclusion. And the board might reasonably conclude that a plant run on sentiment instead of proper banking is a plant that needs proper banking, which I have offered. On terms." Vivian was there, by the window. Cornered, watching, she knew, and Ruth would learn later how much she knew. And she said nothing. Not one word to defend the woman at the desk. She looked out the window at the cold yard and let it happen, and her silence was its own kind of speech. Ruth stood up. She was steady. She was 44 years old, and a foreman's widow, and she had buried a man who bled $9 a week for these people's faith, and she would not let his floor become a courtroom on a payday. "The men will have their pay," she said. "That's the first thing. Whatever's happened here, No man on this floor goes home short, because the office is fighting. I'll make up the 600 from my own savings tonight, and every man is paid to the penny at his usual time. And then, Mr. Meridian, if the board wants my resignation, it can have it. I won't have Tom's men wait on their pay for 1 hour while grown men argue over a box. Their children eat on Friday. That comes first. It always came first. And she meant to walk out with her dignity, out the door and down Depot Street, and out of the plant her husband gave 22 years to, rather than stand and be called a thief in front of the board. Peter stopped her at the door. "No," he said. "Nobody's resigning. Nobody's repaying a dime. Be here on the next payday, Mrs. Calloway, all of you, the board, the bank. Bring your books, Meridian. Bring the note. Bring all of it. And I'll show this room where the $600 went." The next payday the office was full. The board sat along one wall. Harlan Meridian stood by the desk in his overcoat with the note in a leather folder under his arm. Vivian sat apart. And beyond the glass the men were filing in for their pay, 60 of them. 61 if you counted the boy who swept, and they gathered at the office door and did not go to their machines, because a floor hears everything, and the floor had heard that today the widow's name was on the block. Peter Halloran walked in and set 2 things on the desk. He set down the recounted books. And he set down Tom Calloway's private ledger, the small one, out of the dented tin box. "Before anyone touches the cash," Peter said, "I want the board to see 2 numbers. Mr. Meridian says the payroll came up $600 short, and only Mrs. Calloway's hand touched the box. Both those things are true." Here's what he left out. He opened the bank's own audit to the page. The bank's statement to this plant, drawn up in Mr. Meridian's own office, double counts a payment. The same money entered twice, once against our account, once against the note. $600. He looked up. The box wasn't robbed. The bank's arithmetic robbed it. On paper, before Mrs. Calloway ever signed for the cash. The 600 that's missing from this desk is the exact 600 Meridian Trust counted twice into its own favor. It's the same dollar, gentlemen, chased into this room to make an honest woman look like a thief. A murmur went along the board. Harlan Meridian's face did not move, but his hand tightened on the leather folder. "That's a serious charge from a man who can't add," Meridian said. "He can add," Ruth said quietly from the wall. "I taught him." "And it isn't the first time," Peter went on, and now his voice was low, and it carried. 10 years ago the bank made a call on this plant. My father, God forgive him, covered it by shorting the men's pay. A little from each envelope. He was wrong to. And you know what happened, Mr. Meridian? It didn't work. Because the foreman found it in a week. Tom Calloway. And rather than expose my father, and rather than let one man be robbed, Tom paid it back himself. $9 a week out of his own wages for 2 years into these men's envelopes, and never told a soul. Peter's hand came down flat on the small ledger. It's all in here. In his own hand. My family owes this woman's family a debt this town has been telling backward for 10 years. The Hallorans didn't carry the Calloways. A Calloway carried us, in silence, and asked for nothing. The office was dead quiet. Beyond the glass, 60 men stood with their hats coming off, one by one, because they were hearing for the first time why their pay had never once been light in the worst year the plant ever had, and who had made it whole, and it had not been a Halloran. Peter picked up the payroll box, the dented tin box. He turned to Ruth Calloway in front of the board, and the bank, and the whole floor. "The men trust her with their wages," he said. "So do I. I signed her trustee because there's not an honest pair of hands in Ashford I trust more. And today, the bank tried to break the one thing this plant has that money can't buy, which is faith in that box and the woman who counts it. He held the box out to her. "So I'm handing it back to her, in front of all of you, where you can see it." And Ruth, his voice caught. He was 33 years old, and he had never once in his life said a true thing that cost him, and he said one now. "I'd hand you the rest of my life too. If you'd take a plant hands fool who took this long to see what 60 men saw the first Friday. I don't have my father's blessing yet, and I don't have the bank's terms, and I don't care. Vivian, I'm sorry. It was never going to be." Ruth Calloway. In front of everybody. "Will you have me?" The floor did not breathe. Ruth Calloway stood by the wall with her hands folded on her apron, 44 years old, the backbone of a floor, and, she had always told herself, no one's match, forbidden by her own hard rule to want a single thing for herself. And she looked at the box in his hands, the same dented box her Tom had bled into, and she looked at the man holding it out to her in front of the board, and the bank, and every family she'd fed, and the rule she'd lived by broke clean in half. "Peter Halloran," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "I have counted that box for 14 months, telling myself I did it for Tom and for the men. And I did. But I kept coming, some Fridays, for the coffee and the company of one foolish man from Chicago who couldn't butter his own bread when the numbers went bad." She took a breath. "Yes, I'll have you. God help us both." Yes, and Pop Dresser, 61 years on this earth, and never a soft word in public, put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled like a boy. And the floor came apart. 60 men who had once set down their tools rather than take a dime from this man's hand, now stamping and cheering him fit to shake the presses, hats in the air, and the boy who swept jumping to see over their shoulders. The reckoning came after, each piece in its turn, the way a floor settles after the whistle. Harlan Meridian called the note. Of course he did. Beaten in the room, he reached for the one weapon left, the $28,000 paper, and he demanded it paid in full 30 days, knowing they couldn't. He put the leather folder on the desk, and he smiled his banker's smile, and he thought that was the end of it. It was Gideon who beat him. Gideon Halloran, who everyone thought was too far gone up in the big house to lift a pen, sent his nurse down the hill with a letter and his lawyer behind her. The old man had heard, at last, what his boy had done on the floor and what Tom Calloway had done 10 years back, and it seemed to put 10 years of life back in him for 1 week. He sold the family's own land, the hill parcels the bank had held title clean for 2 generations, the Halloran birthright, and he cleared the note to the penny out of the proceeds and freed the plant from Meridian Trust for good, lawfully, cash on the desk, no favor owed to any bank ever again. Harlan Meridian took his paid note and his leather folder and drove his long car out of Ashford and did not come back, beaten by the arithmetic he'd tried to cheat with, and no one in that town ever banked with Meridian Trust again if they could help it. Vivian Meridian left without a scene. She'd known, it came out, that the count was rigged. Known her father drew the 600 short on purpose, and she'd stood by the window and said nothing. When it was done, she put on her furs and stopped in the office doorway and looked at Ruth one time, up and down, the plain navy dress, the scarred desk. "I hope you like the smell of machine oil," she said. One dry line, and she was gone, out to the long car, out of the town, and that was the last anyone saw of her. And Gideon. The old man came down off the hill one time, before the end, in a wheeled chair with a blanket on his knees, and had his nurse push him onto the floor of the plant he'd owned for 40 years, and he asked for Ruth Calloway. She came and knelt by the chair so he wouldn't have to look up. He was so thin. His hand shook on the blanket. "You're Tom," he said. I knew. I always knew what he did. $9 a week. I let him. I let a better man than me pay my debt in silence, and I never once thanked him, because to thank him was to admit what I'd done. His old eyes ran over. "I'm asking you now, since I can't ask him. Forgive it, Ruth. Forgive an old man who was too proud to be honest and let a foreman carry his shame 2 years." Ruth Calloway took the old man's shaking hand in both of hers. "Tom didn't do it to be thanked," she said. "He did it so the men could keep believing in the box. That's all he ever wanted. You want to thank him, Mr. Halloran. You keep believing in the box. You let this floor run honest. That's his headstone. Not stone. That box." Gideon wept, and Pop Dresser and the men stood back and let an old man weep on the floor of his own plant, hats off, and the debt that had run backward through that town for 10 years was spoken out loud at last and set down. Spring came to Ashford, Ohio. The snow went off Depot Street, and the mud dried, and the 2 aging presses ran clean and steady in the long light, and the note was paper in a drawer, paid, dead, harmless. Every other Friday, the men still lined up hats in hand at the pay desk in the office. 60 of them. 61 with the boy who swept. And they waited for the one pair of hands they'd take their money from, and that hadn't changed. Only the name in the ledger had changed. The tidy hand still signed it. But now it read Ruth Halloran, trustee, and the men had gotten used to it faster than the town had, because the men had known who she was for 14 months before the town caught up. Same desk. Same bare bulb, though Peter kept threatening a better one. Same dented tin box that Tom bled into, that she'd carried through the worst year, that held 60 families' faith every other Friday. She licked her thumb. She counted the singles down, never light, never rounded, to the penny. And on the hot plate in the corner the blue enamel pot ticked and sang, and when it was ready. This Friday, like every Friday now, it wasn't Ruth who poured. Peter Halloran came around the desk in his shirt sleeves, the city suit long gone, and he took the blue pot off the plate and he poured her cup first. A little milk. The way she took it. The way he'd learned in 3 cold weeks over a set of books that wouldn't balance, and he set it at her elbow while she counted. And outside the whistle blew for the shift, and the light came gold through the dirty office glass and lay warm on the tin box in her counting hands. She didn't look up from the money. She didn't have to. "Thank you," she said. "Every Friday," he said. Pop Dresser broke a couple of new hires in that spring, young fellows, 19, and he walked them past the office on their first day and stopped them at the glass and let them look in at the widow, the owner's wife now, counting out 60 men's pay under a bare bulb with her husband pouring her coffee, and he told them the one thing they needed to know about Halloran Tool and Die before they ever touched a press. "You'll get paid honest here," Pop said. "Every other Friday, that desk, that box, her hand. And listen to me, boys, because I'll only say it once. Don't ever try to hand a man his pay but her. This whole floor set its tools down once over exactly that, and we'd do it again. She's the one you trust. She always was." And the presses ran, and the pot sang, and in a small plant in a small town in Ohio, a woman who was born the backbone and told herself she'd be no one's match sat counting honest money beside the man who'd chosen her in the open. And that was worth more than what either of them was born to. Because worth isn't the name you carry. It's what people trust you to hold. Wherever you're watching from tonight, comment your town. I'd like to see how far this one travels.